panel that we're going to be introducing here today is called No Cookies, No Problem, Bridging Identity in CTV. So here, Michael, let's take a look at the script you put together for me. So as you may or may not have known, third-party cookies are on their way out. As the cookie keeps crumbling and viewership gets more fragmented, CTV offers healthcare marketers some incredibly valuable identity resolution opportunities. DeepIntent's identity partners help link HCP and patient audiences, which help you reach households and devices at scale. Up next, we've got Jason Raqueno, the IAB Tech Lab Senior Director of Privacy, Identity, and Data Protection, moderating a great panel discussion with 4 of them. Scott Menzer, co-founder and SVP of Customer Operations and Product at ID5. My friend Frans Vermeulen, VP of Strategy and Market Development at Transunion. Sam White, Director of Global Addressability Strategy at Liveramp. And Bob Whiting, a Director at IQVIA. Take it away.
Sit under our names.
I was going to say, the images will tell us which way to go, right?
You guys can compare me to my very outdated headshot.
They try to keep these foolproof.
I'm in the middle. Welcome, everyone. It's good to see everyone in person again. So today's panel is about, it's entitled No Cookies, No Problem, Bridging Identity in CTV. We'll be discussing various things relating to identity and privacy. So we know that CTV's cookieless nature provides almost a natural path for marketers to maintain the same level of targeting, in this new era of deprecation of cookies. Today, CTV devices can be found in over 80% of American homes, and CTV ad budgets are expected to double by 2026, according to a recent industry forecast. Audiences are highly fragmented across multiple CTV platforms, really having their own identity, and their identities be kept behind these walled gardens. We know that's a thing right now in CTV, and this fragmentation is solved by technology that's meant to connect different IDs and make data interoperable between the buy and sell side solutions. So it's really these identity solutions that will help enable real cross-platform planning and measurement. So on our panel today, we have identity partners who will discuss their efforts when it comes to identity and in CTV. We'll also discuss CTV from a privacy perspective and how CTV is a rapidly evolving space with its own unique challenges when it comes to privacy and identity in the user experience. And we know that privacy is particularly important when it comes to use of healthcare data within the CTV space. So I'll start off just by going by each panelist here, asking very specific questions about, I guess, what you're working on and what your companies are doing. So let's start off with Frans.
All right.
So can you speak to some of the key initiatives that Transunion is leading to connect CTV audiences?
Yeah, so if you're not aware, Transunion is actually in this business now. You might know us as a credit bureau or credit ratings agency originally, but the last 5 years, the company's been very acquisitive in building out identity products for all things marketing and marketing solutions. A number of acquisitions, one of which was TrueOptic, where I was the COO. That was and still is, a connected TV specific data marketplace underpinned by a household identity graph. So with that addition about 2 years ago, and now with Newstar as part of the mix, our most recent acquisition, which is more focused on the measurement side of things, there's a bunch of different approaches that we've taken to scaling all things audiences for targeting and now also for measurement into connected TV, all based on this fairly unique underlying, what we refer to as the household graph, which covers about 80 million US households. And that through the pandemic, that increased a little bit. We actually just saw more devices per homes, but we are uniquely specific in this case to streaming audio, streaming video. It is our bread and butter. We've been focusing on it ever since. Now augmented by a whole host of other offerings that TransUnion and Newstar together. So there's a lot there. We've been super focused on streaming the last 3 years and will continue to be.
Amazing. Let's move on to Bob at IQVIA. We know that you know this thing called consent at scale and why this is the best approach to future-proof healthcare and CTV. What sets IQVIA's healthcare data apart?
And so the question mark goes right there. Okay. So, in picking up on what Frans said, so IQVIA has a very interesting position in the marketplace. I think, show of hands, is everybody familiar with IQVIA or has at least touched or worked with IQVIA over time? Right, so we have a unique position in the marketplace, and it is a position of trust. And I'm thinking in today's conversation, we have a tremendous responsibility. We have tremendous responsibility for data accuracy all the way from the offline data to the households, right? In that responsibility over the past number of years, IQVIA is entering the media space, right? So we're talking about what's going on in our world as well. An acquisition of Med Data Group a couple of years ago and an acquisition of DMD just last year bring us squarely and brings IQVIA's data squarely into the media world, right? In the media world, in CTV, in programmatic, across the media spectrum, right? We need consent at scale. And with the acquisition of DMD, that's what IQVIA brings to the table. So it is a fully consented framework, meaning that we do have opt-in consent across channels, across CTV, across email, et cetera, to both deliver ads and perform measurement against these physicians at the individual level. I want to be very clear, as we're talking about this, I'll use physicians. This is the healthcare provider side. We're not doing one-to-one with patients, everybody, so just be very clear, it's the HCP side. So it's that consent framework and data consistency that we hear from all of our pharmaceutical advertisers and their agencies. They want to make sure there's consent from the planning perspective, activation perspective, all the way through to the measurement perspective and outcomes.
Yeah, and so this is a partner, right? So our job is to create as many of those linkages as possible from our data providers and data partners to make sure they can scale in connected TV and elsewhere, both on any signals that are available from IP, like a connected TV ID, which are not really that available, IPs, both IPv4 and IPv6. We're getting nerdy, but I guess that's okay. But yeah, so that's how we work together.
Yeah, you brought up a really good point, Bob, when it comes to consent. Consent is immensely important when it comes to how privacy is really disrupting data use, across all platforms.
I'll add one more quick point to that is that, again, in the healthcare professional space, we're using professional data, right? We understand, the word personalization has come up a number of times today, as personalization as that North Star, right? That direction of one-to-one personalization. We're using a tremendous amount of professional medical claims data to understand who these healthcare professionals are, both from a professional world and also from their treating population and their clinical data use, right? So we then use that data. You have to be. If you're going to serve that ad, if I know that much against Dr. Jane Smith, who's NPI number 12345, I have to have consent if I'm going to personalize that message and put it in a social website, on a website, on CNN.com, or on the screen, right on the big screen with any of the providers here, LG and others. So we have to have that consent.
Absolutely. Great. Let's move on to Scott. So we know that fragmented identification across platforms really limits how brands can engage with the CTV world. How can ID5 solutions help identify users in a privacy compliant way and improve match rates and increase programmatic revenue as well?
Yep. Yeah, we've built an identity platform, and our solution called Identity Cloud is really that kind of culmination of providing identifiers across domains on the web, across apps or devices within the CTV space, and across all devices within a household. We know that in CTV, while there are device identifiers, they're not only prevalent, but many of them, they're not always available. Depending upon the ad request, they could just be blocked by the
or obfuscated.
Obfuscated, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's mostly for privacy or data protection reasons.
So they say.
So they say. But in any case, those IDs aren't being shared, and so identification is much more difficult, or relies on all the middlemen within the ecosystem to try to provide identity. And so what we're looking to do is to help provide a more singular ID that potentially on the kind of sell side, the devices or the manufacturers can be comfortable sharing with us, knowing that we're going to convert it into something that's not their ID, but something that can be used by advertising, and then make that ID shared bringing a more singular and targeted approach for identity, but then allowing also that measurement to take place, most likely not on the TV, but also but online on a device elsewhere, and kind of really pulling it all into a single framework.
Great. Sam, how does Liveramp's authenticated traffic solution help publishers and platforms connect their CTV inventory to advertiser demand, in this context of, cookies disappearing, IP addresses, and device IDs as well?
Yeah, so about 4 years ago, we started building out infrastructure for both the supply side and the demand side and the platforms that sit in between to make every media experience addressable, but also critically for advertisers measurable. So what that means is initially we saw the cookie problem of Chrome and Safari getting rid of the cookie as an impetus to build a suite of APIs for publishers to connect their authenticated inventory to advertiser demand. But we rapidly saw that actually works quite well for mobile and CTV as well. So we started making it more of an omni-channel approach, whereby embedding a consistent definition of identity into the supply side, into the platforms that transact between. So in the example you both gave, the ad call, the bid request from the SSP to the DSP, all these signals that flow between the platforms, replacing the fragmented identifiers like the IP, like the cookie, like the mobile ad ID, that have historically made it difficult for buyers and sellers to coordinate. So the result that we've been working towards is a neutral infrastructure that lets a buyer work with any DSP, any SSP, any other platform that they want to partner with to find inventory at scale and make that 100% measurable. And in the long run, we think that in the absence of the cookie, in the absence of the MAID, which are potentially less prevalent in CTV, the trust that the user has by logging in and authenticating is going to be the long-run viable option. And so that's what we've built as the foundation of the infrastructure.
Great. So we'll move on to probably the hottest topic of the day. We'll talk about privacy. So I'll start off with Scott and then come back down here.
Yeah.
The first question is, we all know that privacy is changing the way that digital advertising is done across the industry, especially in web and mobile. But is CTV immune from this privacy disruption?
Yeah, it's definitely not. It's just as important as anywhere. I mean, we're talking about consumer privacy and the laws that exist in Europe or California or other places don't say this is for the web. They're laws in general, they apply everywhere. CTV is one of those places. I think it's different in how it may be executed because of the nuances of CTV. CTV is in a household, so there may be more than one viewer at a time. So whose consent do you need for that request for that ad? People do log in. There's often profiles associated to that. So there may be one profile that's used for the whole household. So it may be me watching the TV, but it's my wife's login. So how do you know that I've consented if she's? So there's nuances versus your mobile phone, which is more often than not a one-to-one device. So I think we have to work through those challenges, but it's absolutely not immune to say we don't have to worry about consent in CTV.
Yeah, totally agree. We see the same thing, especially as a highly regulated credit bureau, the core of Transunion. I'm not involved in that bit and piece, so yeah, I can't help you with your credit scores or anything. I would go to jail if I did. I've learned that in my compliance videos. Anyway, same thing. I think the same challenge we have is individual versus home, right? And that nature of where do you collect consent, who for either consenting in or opting in, as well as potentially opting out. Like who's got the right to opt out in the household? Is it just the kid who hits the wrong button? And then is it that app? Is it that piece of content? Is it that device, but not the device in your home? Right? So like all of those challenges I think are will continue, right? And when you look at the laws and the regulation, they're basically muted on that. There's no description of the differences. So like we're kind of on our own. And we see that with our publishers as well, who are struggling to really understand, like, how do we manage consent and opt-ins and opt-outs kind of all together in a world where kind of the laws are aimed at individuals, but we're talking about a shared experience in the home, right, with multiple devices all connected to that same kind of home router. So we see those challenges a lot.
Yeah, I definitely agree with both of you that CTV is not immune, and I think we can start to look at the rulings from the Belgian DPA, from the Austrian DPA in Europe, and also the attempts of other regions like Latin America to replicate the GDPR to satisfy the EU's adequacy condition in terms of how that law is going to be applied. I think it's going to get legislated and then enforced through the courts, and what we've started to see is that in terms of passing consent at the individual versus the household level, the TCF string, for example, that one of the issues that the Belgian DPA had with that is that it passes my consent and a signal about my consent to partners who potentially aren't really prepared to receive it. So in CTV, how can we think about, at the household level, what does that mean? When I consent to something on behalf of my household, how does that propagate to the other members of my household?
Yeah, and in some ways it creates even more of like a privacy intrusion just to comply with the regulation as interpreted, right? Like, how do I opt out? Well, I have to give you my email to opt out, but I didn't give you my email before, and now I'm giving you PII just for compliance reasons.
Yeah.
You know, I think that, and as usual, right, the Belgians leading the way in Europe. That's not uncommon.
I think the implication of that, though, is that we should focus on opt-in primarily, and we can't count on there being a consistent opt-out signal that's going to satisfy every regulator and legislator.
So imagine a world where I'm the fourth guy and I'm like, no, they're all wrong, right? privacy doesn't matter at all in the CTV world. It's so interesting, our collective business, right? The DeepIntent marketing team is fantastic, but right now we could pull CTV off this, right? And we're talking about privacy, we're talking about cookie lists, we're talking about channels, we're talking about engagement. Absolutely, privacy is at the forefront. It's at the privacy of everything that IQVIA does, stem to stern, right? On the patient and the healthcare professional side. One of the things that comes to mind when I'm listening to the three of you talk and just conversations around here too is just back to two things. One is the tremendous responsibility we have, and what comes with tremendous responsibility is also the way to overcome some of this is full transparency. So I didn't hear anywhere along here or in this group here, no, we got it all solved, right? When you sit down with a pharmaceutical marketer who's spending a lot of money that we've been exposed to today, nobody's saying that, no, this is all rock solid, we've got it solved end to end, but everybody's really transparent about, here are some of the loopholes, right? Here are some of the considerations along the way. And oh, by the way, we're not ignoring them, right? We're working towards this, and these are the steps. And these are the partners we're working with, and these are the technologies we're working with to get us from where we are today to tomorrow, where we're better. We're perfect. We might all be retired by the time we hit perfect, but we'll be better over and over time with great transparency like this.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like everyone's in consensus that privacy is really disrupting the industry, and we need to get ahead of it, especially in CTV.
And there's a whole crop of new startups in this area as well to manage consent between brands and consumers. There's 3 or 4 that come to mind. Like, all that stuff is happening now, right? Like, I think that's exciting for brands. In particular, I would imagine I'm not in no way, shape, or form a pharma expert, so I feel a little out of my depth in this room with all these great experts. But, that does give some hope that as we manage different ways of engaging with consumers through their phones, et cetera, household or outside the household, right? There's just a whole interesting sort of tech area for those that are, students, or if you will, of the industry. It's pretty exciting.
Great.
Just a quick add before you go to the next one. On that point, one of the things that I'm just personally, but I also think for a best practice for this room, I think everybody practices already. All the things we're looking to do are hard.
Yeah.
Right? So all the things we're looking to do are hard. But it's just that insane curiosity about how we make it better. And just anybody that's from the pharma side, the agency side, the vendor side, the data side, et cetera, the governing body side, just that insane curiosity will also help us get a lot better. Yep. Always how are you doing it? Why are you doing it? Is that the right way? It's a best practice.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So let's move on to the next question here. What are companies doing to address, what are your companies doing, or what have you seen other companies doing to address privacy in CTV? Let's start off with Bob.
Again, it's really across the board. So, here I can speak broadly to both the consumer audience and the healthcare professional audience, right? We're perpetually involved in maintaining a consent framework.
Yep.
That includes work with publishers, work with our own processes, but that consent framework on the healthcare professional side at the individual level, Again, it's a perpetual and ongoing process. And on the consumer side, the patient side, right, it is adherence to meet or exceed industry standards around compliant audience modeling, HIPAA compliance, and things of that nature.
Yep.
Again, we're talking about really big companies here, right? And consent needs to be at the core of everything that we do, and it certainly is at IQVIA.
Great.
From our side, I mean, we're investing in partnerships in this area. One of them with a company, a startup, if you will, called Consent with a Q. It's for you, Aaron. We did a big partnership there where we're the identity infrastructure for the consent platform itself. So when a consumer signs up, we're validating that their identity is actually who they are to manage any risk, and then enable the platform and the marketer, right, in this case, the business of consent, QONCNT, with the consumer to make sure that that consent is being managed properly and is actually the person who they say they are. And that's one of the things that we're doing.
Yep.
Can I ask a question to that?
Sure.
Can I ask a curious question? So is that,
Yeah.
I mean, that's massive, right? So you're the underpinning of that
Well, a huge
consent.
public company basically
Right.
making a strategic not investment, but a bet basically, right, on the next generation of consent management. So
And is that underlying graph, is that all US
that is
households?
our footprint of 260 million US adults and 120 million homes. Yeah, everything.
That's huge.
Yeah, from our side, not the same scale. We're a much smaller company, but we're both looking in house at what are we doing internally? What tech can we build? What can we rely on for that? But the other piece is really around on the industry side. We're taking part in industry working groups like Crosswalk, looking at what PETs and that kind of privacy enhancing technologies. What's out there that the industry is looking into? How can we help shape that? How can we help make those standards? Because at the end of the day, if we have fragmented identities, device IDs today, if we come away with fragmented consent solutions, it's still going to be a mess. So we as an industry need to come away with a common way to capture that consent and define the rules of which consent do we need, and then how do we share that, and making sure that the vendors and the platforms and the marketers that are downstream from the device are getting what they need to be compliant and ahead of compliance.
Yeah.
And so we're actively taking roles in a lot of those working groups.
Great. Sam, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's easy for the conversation about privacy to get a bit esoteric. So I mean, I appreciate the examples you guys are giving, and so to follow in that, like, we're trying to make every media experience addressable and measurable, and for a publisher and a brand coordinating to make a media buy work in that fashion. The example is, let's say I'm a publisher. I want to connect my base of, say, 100 million authenticated users without sharing that data. So you're talking about privacy enhancing technology. That's really the best thing that you can do if you're an InfoSec team looking at a deal like that. So how can we connect this data without moving it? But then as the advertiser, how can I frequency cap, and how can I connect my audience of high value audience members to that inventory? And so what we're doing is to protect from the regulatory and legislative issues around privacy, removing the need to use the IP address so directly in that. And while the IP address remains, we're definitely supporting matching to it for the scale of users who don't log in, which will always be a large percentage of inventory and marketer audience. But in the absence of that, helping connect those two data sets without sharing it by embedding the identity in the platform. So the DSP and the SSP can read who this person is to apply the frequency cap across publishers without each publisher having to share their data, IP or personal information through the chain in any way.
Great. We kind of talked about this already, but I want to unpack this idea of the user experience in CTV. So we know that privacy consent and the user experience in CTV is different than in web and mobile. What are some of the privacy and user experience challenges that are specific to CTV?
I've got one. Not shocking. Account sharing. Okay, huge problem. Netflix stock notwithstanding. I'm not an equity analyst, but I feel like I should be. The fact that 52% of all Netflix accounts are shared with concurrent streaming happening in multiple locations, basically at the same time, and the entire streaming industry for the last, whatever, since it became important, let's say 2012, 13, when connected TV started really becoming, a viable medium for all of us to do business in. It throws off so much of consent, privacy management, opt-in, opt-out. If I'm sharing my ad-supported, whatever, Hulu login with my brother in California, I live in Connecticut, who's to say which is which and how do you deduplicate all of that stuff? I think that is one of the biggest challenges that is pretty unique, I think, to you're not sharing your Pandora login from your phone, maybe you are, but probably not nearly as much as people are sharing accounts for both, SVOD services, hybrid SVOD and AVOD services. Maybe the ad-supported guys, the purely ad-supported guys like Tubi not as much, but still, that remains a massive challenge that we just have to sort through.
Great. Bob, what are your thoughts here?
What he said. Tremendous challenge, right? And
Yeah.
the great things about a lot of things we're talking about too are we personalize this, right? I don't share any of my passwords or take anybody else's passwords, right? So,
I borrowed an account for the first time in the past year.
But I know probably 6 months
Watch
ago
Ted Lasso. It's worth
I
it.
read a small article about that, but
Yeah.
right, that is when we talk about maybe one of the biggest challenges in the industry, and that's really hard to solve. I'm not sure how you do that, right? When we talk about privacy at the home and in a similar fashion, right? One of the things I was educated on that the folks at DeepIntent are doing, and I suspect others, Jen gave me this education this morning, right? Is how do we at least provide some levels of protection maybe against populations like kids,
Yep.
right? So how do we make sure that we're not serving ads during, I don't even know what the kids shows are. Ren and Stimpy, anybody, right?
Oh, dude.
Or Phineas and Ferb, one of my old-time
I thought
favorites.
Prohaska was dating himself.
Yeah.
Probably
You
been off the
really
show
just took
for
the cake.
or Bugs Bunny. But the level of being able to identify and the power of CTV, right? To be able to identify the content, the channel, the time of day, the day of week, all those dimensions, and add a level of privacy based on the content as well. It's fascinating. It's something I wasn't thinking about this morning, but again, that's why we have really smart people thinking about that. So,
I think that's really true. I think the multiple login, your shared logins, multiple people using the device. I think what that leads to is it's important to not just look at the logged in user.
Yeah.
Right. That's a key point, but we need to look at more signals than just that. It's not enough just to say this user's logged in and therefore their consent preferences are XYZ and this user's results in this data set that applies to them. But looking at other signals, whether it's the content, so giving you context, the other signals that again may not want to be shared through the OpenRTB system, like IP address or other kind of specific devices.
And logging timestamps,
anything,
it's
but
super important, right? That's
Right.
a good way to begin to fight that.
Exactly.
It's just having that timestamped understanding of
Yep.
it. Again, super nerdy, technical,
and kind of collecting those signals that can be used at a trusted place and allowing those to be shared. And so a single login that's used across the country, we can still differentiate on two different IDs because they're on two different IP addresses. They can't possibly be the same person. So I think it's really looking at the whole part and not just individual tactics when we look at identity and privacy in CTV.
that sounds really hard.
Well, fortunately, I think that where IP has often been used to do that deduplication, and where we have to now look beyond potentially in a couple of years being able to use IP to infer geography to do that. I think Transunion and the credit bureaus offer products that let you use a spine to connect people's identity in the offline world without having to use an IP address.
Yeah.
So the question is, how can you embed that into a clean room or a first-party environment in a way that
You
doesn't
said clean room
require you-
first.
I did it. It was me. You can blame me after.
Yeah.
Embed that in an environment without having to connect signals or, like you mentioned, pass
Yeah.
them through ORTB or through a private deal even, and put re-identification at risk. Because I think for the pharma overlay of context here, that's really the outcome you need to avoid, is having sensitive patient data re-identified from either an IP address or even IP timestamp or an email IP timestamp to say, okay, this was a person who viewed a sensitive ad that can now be inferred to say something about my condition or something that would put the marketer at risk.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway here is if you're still watching Ren and Stimpy, you definitely want to keep that private, right? So I want to talk about tech standards here. So the IAB Tech Lab is standardizing privacy and consent signals in the digital advertising chain through something that's called the Global Privacy Platform, or GPP, which is actually due for release soon. So I just wanted to make everyone aware here of the GPP. And also at the IAB, there's a working group called Project Crosswalk, which Scott mentioned earlier. It basically includes reps from across the CTV industry, and they meet regularly to look at things like privacy compliance and CTV. So I encourage everyone here to get involved where you can, because we know that standardization will be very key moving forward of ensuring privacy within the CTV landscape. So moving on to the next set of questions here. How do you expect the CTV privacy and identity space to change over the next few years? So let's look ahead, 5-10 years from now. What CTV trends do you think will persist into the future? Let's start off with Scott at the end here and come back around.
You get to go first every time. It's
Great. Yeah. I think, if we look 5 years from now, we're going to be looking at hopefully less fragmentation in some of the, like I mentioned before, in the areas that we need to be working together. We need standardization, whether that's privacy, whether that's identity, whether that's data. We need ways to communicate that in a standardized way that allows marketers to reach the audiences they want in a privacy compliant way, and allows the sellers of that to make their revenue and continue to produce content. How we get there, that's certainly up in the air. But I think that's one main thing that we will see is we have to eliminate some of the fragmentation that we have today.
Yeah. I think from our perspective, we are supporting a number of, and I think you referenced this before, like industry identifiers, for lack of a better term, right? The Trade Desk sponsoring the UID, is it 2 now? 2. Tied to an email, maybe not ideal for connected TV use cases. But there are a number of other industry participants. I think if you're familiar in the TV landscape with OpenAP, it's a consortium of a lot of the big TV networks, standardizing audiences, but also being able to transact on an OpenAP ID, which covers both linear and digital. I think that came up in the McLagan panel. And underpinning those IDs is actually Transunion. So behind the scenes, that's us. Same thing at Horizon. Their Blue ID is effectively powered by the Transunion identity infrastructure. We do that on a limited basis, but to be able to trade on those, a few of those synthetic identifiers that really matter for TV and kind of put connected TV in that, we'll see a lot more of that in actual scale trading on those synthetic IDs. And again, we support as many of those as we think will make sense. Again, there won't be hundreds of them. Maybe there's 5 to 10 that matter.
Yeah, I think looking 5-10 years ahead, the biggest change we're trying to prepare all of our clients and partners for is the removal of the IP address, not just from Safari or Chrome, but from a lot of the places it's used in the platforms that sit in between the buyer and the seller. I think it's used a lot more pervasively than a lot of buyers are really anticipating right now. That's going to cause a lot more disruption in CTV buys and, more importantly, CTV measurement than a lot of us are expecting. So you mentioned, email is not going to be sufficient in CTV to replace where a lot of these identifiers sit in programmatic, whether it's programmatic guaranteed deals or otherwise. So we're looking at how we can use name and postal data without having to share it through many platforms.
Which sounds worse than an IP address.
It sounds worse.
It's like ironic. It's funny.
It is, but I think that's what the legislators are driving a lot of platforms to, and even buyers to do, is look at the first party data they do have. But I think the key for using that data safely is going back to opt-in and consistently using that opt-in to keep the data within one silo and not share it across partners. You only share the signal of it.
I don't think, sorry, just to jump
No,
in.
go ahead.
I don't think IP is going away fundamentally. Like the internet needs
Right.
IPs to exist. So IPs aren't going away. I think what you're right about is that IPs are not going to be just proliferated through bid streams.
Agreed.
You're not going to be passing an IP from platform 1 through 99 in the chain to let them do IP targeting and how a lot of CTV is done today. I think that gets back to my point before, is that those signals, whether it's name and postal or IP address or email or device ID, we need to get something trusted close to the source and use that as a translation layer that can be converted into something that is privacy safe and is consented, but on its own doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And pass that through the bid stream that is maybe a one-time use or a very short limited use that we can then still do everything we want to do. And you can take that something, that identifier, that graph, whatever, and move it onto your other devices and do that measurement. So it's a nuance. I don't think it's gone, but it's going to be much more restricted to what we have today.
Yeah, our position is a little different. We're a little less concerned about IP quote unquote going away, especially I should say, not specifically in connected TV and for connected TV use cases. A lot of the changes that have been proposed have nothing to do with connected TV, right? Safari is not in a connected TV. So we're a little less concerned about it than maybe our friends here at Liveramp. But again, I think being consistent and working through synthetic identifiers and being that kind of intel inside is a good step forward.
Yeah, I think where we probably differ there is that where we also don't see it going away, just like a first-party cookie or these things in browsers won't go away. But the ability to match them, like you said, throughout the chain is going to definitely go away.
It's going to change how we do it, yeah.
Cross-channel frequency capping is going to go away if we aren't able to, I think, Jason, like you said, set a standard for how that happens throughout the ecosystem. That's where I think standards come into play.
Yep.
Isn't 5 to 10 months ahead hard enough? And you're asking us for 5 to 10 years ahead from now? If you could just tell me in your crystal ball what that unique, super private, interoperable identity would be, then we could just jump right there. That would be fantastic.
There you go.
That is the holy grail. So
I think it's not one though. I think it's a few. It's not a lot. It's a few
No.
that matter.
It's a few that matter,
It's
and
kind
those,
of like currency and measurement.
and like
There's
a lot
few
of
that
things,
matter.
like a lot of things, where we ultimately land probably doesn't exist right now.
Yeah.
Right? It'll be a version of learning along the way, and the three of you will probably be right out in front of a lot of that learning that does build kind of the ultimate identity and checks all the boxes of interoperability and consent, maybe domestic and even international, right? It avoids the subscription sharing, right? It solves all the problems. I completely agree with these guys. I think what makes this job challenging and super fun every morning is we're not there yet, so there's 100 horses in the race. We have to be on every single one of those horses between now and that ultimate goal. So that's the fun part between now and then.
Great. I'm getting the 5-minute mark here. So second last question, very quickly. What advice do you have for audience members here who are starting out in privacy and identity in CTV? Bob?
Curiosity and expect transparency, right? So I think as an industry, there are certain areas of our business, we have a tremendous responsibility to our ultimate advertisers. And that responsibility requires that we do many things correctly, that offline data is accurate, that correlation between offline data to digital identity is accurate, that it's all privacy safe. We have a tremendous responsibility, and I think best practice and advice to everybody in the room is be curious and ask questions. And if you get a bullshit answer, ask the question again. Like, don't settle for second rate or I don't know or don't worry, let's go have a drink. That doesn't work. So be curious, challenge your vendors, challenge everybody in this room and from end to end in this ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, like my answer is almost identical, and but I would maybe slightly spin it by saying specifically ask why. Like focus on the why. Why are device identifiers going away? Why are these pieces of legislation being put into place? What's the theme behind them, and what does that imply for me as a marketer? And I think it generally comes back to trust, and it comes back to what trust am I building with my audience? What trust am I building with patients? And then how does my action tie back to that? And the answer to the why that I get.
Yeah, I would just say know your vendors, right? At the end of the day, you might not be working directly with a Transunion on identity. Maybe you're buying pharma audiences from our data marketplace through the Trade Desk or Jamloop or some other, or SpotX and Magnite. A lot of those segments are all there for connected TV, but know what those linkages are. Know who they're using for identity. Right, and even just sort of working, there's a few of us that can really do it well. I think two of them are on the stage here. But understand your vendors, understand how they're doing it, and just make sure you're being cognizant of that,
Yeah.
even if you're not working with us directly.
Yeah, I would just say lean in and go above and beyond. I think we're at a point where if we can, as an industry and as individual companies, really step beyond what the regulation is, or even in some places in the U.S., no regulation, right? Set our own high bar and really, kind of try to identify what we need to do better. We can set up ourselves so that we don't have regulations coming in saying you can't do something. We've already said we're not going to do that. We're gonna be here and really try to go, beyond what is the bare minimum.
Great. I think we have 1 minute left. I need to ask this question. What would you rather do on a Saturday night? Work on solutions for identity and privacy in CTV, or binge watch Ozark in CTV?
I've got a couple seasons of Ozark left to do, so I'm going to go with that one.
Yeah. I'm too old to work on the weekends too much now. I've been at this too long. Definitely the Ozark answer.
It would be a really easy question for me if I hadn't just already watched all of it. So I guess I'm going to have a bad
I
Saturday
think the
night.
last tranche is just out, right?
I just
Second part of season 3.
Well, can the answer be both?
You got a lot to check.
Right? Can I not have my device and my screen up at the same time? Because I can pause my CTV, solve for identity, and go back to CTV
you
again,
go.
right?
There
Like
you
that.
go.
It's non-linear.
There you go. Thanks so much, everyone.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks.